My dear Divyavani viewers, welcome to this program on the Word of God. Last week I shared with you some thoughts about the book of Exodus, the historical setting of the Exodus, how the people of Israel were liberated from the slavery in Egypt, how that was the central event of a faith experience for the people of Israel. It was a faith experience because Yahweh lived with them, moved with them, and guided them. The people of Israel accepted and acknowledged Yahweh as their God. And in that way, the bond between the people of Israel and Yahweh was really concretized. This event of the faith experience was repeated in the liturgical celebrations of the Israelites. The historical setting of the whole event, I already explained. Historically, the Israelites must have moved out of Egypt somewhere in the middle of the 13th century BC, maybe 1240, 1250. And there are other experts who think that these events took place already in the 15th century BC, but all the available evidence is strongly in favor of the date I gave, something like 1240, 1250 BC. And the evidence is mainly from the two cities built by Ramesses II, which is mentioned in the Bible, Pithom and Ramesses, that is in Exodus chapter 1 verses 11. And the events that took place as Exodus must have also taken place there. One thing that we certainly know is these two cities, known as the supply cities, were built by Ramesses II in the northeast corner of the Nile Delta, and the term city of Ramesses was never used after the year 1100. So these are some of the clear evidences for favoring the view the Exodus took place something like 1240 BC. And the events connected with the Exodus are very, very faith-forming events. As Ramesses II made them work, the Israelites learned to work for him, for the country. The Exodus literature is more or less, it's not a historical scientific testimony, but a popular literature. The popular literature blending various elements of different literary types corresponding to Israel's basic perceptions and attitudes. In the plagues, for example, there is a clear evidence of legendary embellishment. In the crossing of the Red Sea, there is all the dramatization of an epic event. In the rubrics for Passover, the effects of liturgy are obvious. In the covenant code and in the priestly legislation, the legal hand is at work. And in chapter 15, the songwriter is present. The variety of these literary types and they are all popular literature. They witness to the variety of the human efforts to capture a central experience. Trying to unify this perhaps is in vain. It's not possible. We have to only understand the faith experience of the people, the way they understood it, the way they experienced it. And that is the way we should also allow this book to be read. One important observation is that there are at least 4 theological trends. The theological trends are very clearly, the first one is known as the Yahwist, who wrote more or less in the 10th century BC. He wrote more or less in the time of David and Solomon, and his writings are noted by one particular usage of Yahweh for God, the name of Yahweh. The Elohist, the second one, is the Elohist, who wrote more or less in the 8th or 9th century, and that was in a way a period of religious turmoil, and there is an effort to syncretize all these, to unify all these, but the Elohist is noted especially because he uses Elohim as the title name for God. The third trend is the priestly writer, who actually tries to instill a certain amount of hope into the Israelites at a time of the debacle of the second exile. 587 BC, when the Israelites were again led away into Babylon as slaves, and all the efforts of the prophets to make the people return to Yahweh, to obey God's commands and so on, were in vain. And despite all that, there was the effort to make the people hope for a liberation one day. And that is the third theological trend that is easily seen, the priestly one. There are people who try to harmonize these, but the experts say there is no way of harmonizing. Read the book of Exodus as it is and reflect, let it work in your mind. There is no point in trying to canonize any one trend, because God has given us this, and actually we should simply allow that trend of all the various theological trends, some of them conflicting, but then learn to reflect and understand it. With this, I would like to move on to another element, that is a deep reflection on the events of the Exodus. The deep reflection shows that Exodus was a supreme movement of liberation. Supreme movement of liberation from a clear slavery to a new life, guided by God's principles, God's commands. And that liberation movement is needed even today. In South America, there was a clear movement, and that is still going on. There are theologians who are advocating this movement, and there are certainly also contrary comments. All the discussion and debate that is going on regarding the liberation movement, they are all relevant in a way, but all that I would like to emphasize is not taking any side all that I want to emphasize is liberation is a movement that is needed even today. The reason is there is still slavery. There is still exploitation. There is still all those situations that existed in the time of the pharaohs. There is a situation where people are exploited, and that exploitation perhaps is not so evident. It is tacit, and that's the reason why it is still continuing. The early slavery was clear, whereas the present slavery is almost disguised. This slavery, because it is disguised, is not noticed, but the slavery is there, and we need liberation. We'll pause for a while. We'll come back after a few minutes. Welcome back. I was sharing with you a reflection on the book of Exodus, on those events of liberation from Egypt's slavery to a new life for the Israelites. This liberation is something that is very much needed. If only we read the events of Exodus and reflect on its impact, it will lead us to various wider implications of the Exodus itself as a movement of liberation. The liberation theologians, they keep rereading the text in a new light, and they do find real inspiration for what they are now standing for, that is, liberation of the people who are being exploited. This exploitation is rather tacit, rather disguised. There is no clear, direct kind of a slavery at present, perhaps, but there is slavery where people are exploited in various ways. Some of them use actually government policies, even the rules, laws enacted are actually exploiting the people. The way taxation, for example, I'm not saying taxation should not be there. The government also needs money. But the way that is done is another way of exploitation. The liberation theology invites us to reflect and find out where this exploitation exists and to seek liberators like Moses, who are able to really recognize it and deliver the people from such disguised way of slavery. The ongoing human concern to uncover the manipulation of fellow humans and to proffer the means of genuine human transformation. That is what we should look for. The Exodus story also underlines the need for the emergence of ever new prophets after the manner of Moses. Moses was called by God. Moses was given a mission, and the mission was clear to him. The people also accepted that mission. Now perhaps we will have to find new Moseses with the new mission. And there is always that critical question, will the people accept this new Moses? This is something that is not in our hands. We don't know. We don't know what will happen. But that an effort is to be made so that the people are liberated. That there is an effort made to liberate the people who are being exploited by finding out how they are being exploited. That will be a greater task that we all perhaps have to start. We have to articulate also what genuine freedom implies. It's another difficult task. What is freedom in the present world? Often freedom means licentiousness, but the genuine freedom is elsewhere. If we seek and find the genuine freedom and understand the meaning of genuine freedom, then we will be able to liberate our people. There are ever new pharaohs who would impose their will on the people, and these pharaohs perhaps will be claiming to be semi-gods, and we have to unmask these gods or these semi-gods. We must do our part so that the people will understand that this is a mission that is necessary. Moses could liberate Israelites and lead them away from the brickyards of Pharaoh. Today, the brickyard is something perhaps very, very different. And Moses transcends all the limitations of the 13th century BC to let God's word have an ever new impact on the people. If we keep this in mind and reread the book of Exodus, we will be inspired by God Himself to do what is needed. That is a mission that is left to each one of us. With this little remark, I would like to continue to explain the book of Exodus a little more in detail. So far what I gave was the historical background, the historical situation, and even the historical timing. That was the 13th century BC. And because of all the events, complicated events, it's not easy to keep a list of all that in mind. All I request you is to keep in mind the main events and to keep reflecting. What does God want me to learn from these events? What does God want me to learn from these particular events led by Moses, led by God Himself, accepted by the people? If we go through the book of Exodus from the first chapter onwards, I would like to just very briefly mention the situation. Remember, the book of Exodus as we have it now might have been put together, edited, possibly in 400 BC. So not very old. Now, if you keep the timing more or less, the Exodus events took place, let us say, in the 13th century. I said 1240, 1250. From the 10th century, various theological trends entered. The Yahwist, for example, in the 10th century, that was the time of King David and Solomon. After that, there was the Yahwist who worked perhaps during the time of the political turmoil after Solomon's death. Remember, the Israelite kingdom was split and there was always wars and all that. The third group, priestly one, during the debacle of the 6th century BC, the fall of Jerusalem in 587 BC, when Jerusalem was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar took away all the workable people, working class people who were healthy, took away to Babylon as slaves. The prophets were repeatedly warning them, if you don't listen to God, you will be taken as slaves. And that is what happened. But then, prophets could not stop it. Actually, the prophets also were taken together with the people as slaves to Babylon, which was a pitiful sight in a way. And in Babylon, they were actually crying, weeping, thinking of Babylon. And the prophets, again, what they did, their only task was to instill into these disappointed people a certain amount of hope that God one day will rescue them. God one day will allow them to return to Israel, to return to Jerusalem. The prophets went on telling the people, don't worry about the present situation. A day will come, you will return home. And that happened. That happened, let us say, in 530 BC, when Darius allowed the Israelites to return, and not only allowed them, he made everything possible to return home. This was a dilemma for the Israelites. They were allowed to return home, but then many thought, if we return to Israel, we return to Jerusalem, who will recognize me? Who will recognize me as your people, as your relatives? Who will recognize that this land belongs to me? Who will recognize that this house belongs to me? Imagine their dilemma. And with all that, they went. They went because that was the order of the king. They went and they started rebuilding their houses, rebuilding the temple. We'll continue the next week. Interesting to reflect on all these historical events. Thank you very much for listening to me. May God be with you. May God guide you.